Undeceptions podcast. That's the sound of an angry group of Bob Dylan fans. In 1965, Bob Dylan was one of the biggest artists in the world, right up there with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Except that Dylan was decidedly folk, a style that usually subtly critiqued the brash, materialistic, confected rock and roll. But in July of 65, Dylan took to the stage at the Newport Folk Festival, armed not with his trademark acoustic guitar, the beautiful Gibson Nick Lucas Special, but with a Fender Stratocaster. He launched into an electrified rendition of his hit Maggie's Farm. The result, according to the Time magazine article about it, was this. Dylan was, quote, roundly booed by folk song purists who considered this innovation the worst sort of heresy. Dylan had gone electric and his fans weren't happy. But Dylan was unrepentant.
He just changed altogether. He's changed from what he was. He's not the same as what he was at first.
You don't even recognise him.
No.
About a year ago, I saw him here in Sheffield at the City Hall and I thought he was magnificent. And, I thought he just couldn't improve if he tried. Then the next thing that happened was he went really commercial with this backing group, and I didn't like that very much. I don't know what he's trying to do. I think he's conceding to to some sort of popular taste. I think it's a bad thing. I think he's prostituting himself.
Mate, you're sick listening to this rubbish now.
That is so funny. It's a clip from one of Dylan's shows in England in 1966, from Sheffield to be precise. Enough said. It's now called the Dylan Goes Electric incident. Dylan's decision to depart from folk style and weave in some rock style remains one of the great controversies of modern music history. Because, friends, genre matters. Genre, our categorization of art, music or literature, has always been a divisive topic. Dylan's experimentation is either a heresy or it's a bold piece of creative expression. It all depends how you think about genre, or perhaps just which genres you prefer. At this point, researcher Al wanted me to offer a personal view of U2's 9th studio album, Pop, which Al says is a, quote, cool record. Sorry, mate, there shall be no comment on number 9. Numbers 1 to 7, absolutely. I'll even give you 10, 11 and 12, but 8 and 9 and 13 and 15, nah, moving right along. In music, movies, art, literature, the genre debate is everywhere. Tasteful folks like producer Kaylee like Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, Marilyn Robinson. Director Mark, well, he just reads, what do you call it, mate? Sci-fi? Sci-fi? Whatever. My point is, genre can be a hot topic, especially when people work across multiple genres, or they merge genres, or they even add genres within genres. And perhaps the biggest culprit of all, well, is God. Arguably, no book in the history of the world has more genres, more merged genres, and genres within genres than the Bible. I believe in God. I believe God is ultimately the author of the Bible, and that means God is Dylan on steroids. He likes all 15 U2 albums. It's possible he even likes Ski-Fi. It's time to get our heads around Bible genres. I'm John Dixon, and this is Undeceptions. This season of Undeceptions is sponsored by our friends at Zondervan Academic. You can get discounts on their special master lectures, video courses, and free chapters of many of the books that we talk about here on the pod. All you got to do is just go to zondervanacademic.com/Undeceptions. Each episode at Undeceptions, we explore some aspect of life, faith, history, science, music, culture, or ethics that's either much misunderstood or mostly forgotten. With the help of people who know what they're talking about, we're trying to undeceive ourselves and let the truth out. Okay, so we are rock and rolling, mate. What is a genre? I mean, it just sounds so pretentious. French even.
It is probably, that is. What is a genre? A genre is like any other kind of way that we communicate. It's a convention. The difference between a genre and any other convention of the English language is that we use the conventions of a genre in some circumstances, but not in other circumstances. And that's what makes genres kind of tricky.
That's Andy Judd, or the Reverend Dr. Andrew Judd. He teaches Old Testament, hermeneutics and biblical theology at the wonderful Ridley College in Melbourne, Australia. His PhD is about as nerdy as you can imagine. It's a high-level interaction with the latest English lit stuff around genre and interpretation, and then it's a proposal for why that stuff needs to be brought to bear on biblical scholarship. And because only about 7 people are likely to understand his PhD, though hundreds will pretend, he's just published a very readable, actually really fun book for the rest of us, called, of course, Modern Genre Theory, an introduction for biblical studies. Is a podcast interview a kind of genre?
Absolutely. You start with your banter and then you move into the first kind of opening conversation. Eventually there'll be
my talking notes.
A message from your sponsors halfway through.
With banter. Yeah, right.
That's right.
Throw me out some that come to mind in our modern experience that my listeners will have maybe come across today.
So you might have read a novel last night as you were off to bed, or you might have picked up a news article in the morning, and you might have listened into a podcast episode, Undeceptions itself. But then you might have received a text message from your mum, or you might have seen a Facebook post or a self-promoting LinkedIn kind of post. These are all different genres because they're different things that we do in society. You got a letter from your bank, you got a letter from your mum. They're different things. You listen to a song on the radio versus you listen to the traffic report. They're all doing different things in society. You watched a horror film, you watched the news. Maybe you watched the news and thought it was a horror film. But there's different genres that we participate in different circumstances, and there's millions of them, and they have different rules, and that's what makes them kind of tricky, because are we joking around or are we being serious? Is this a satirical news article? Is this a real news article? And that's where we get into trouble with genre, because if you misdiagnose a genre, even though we're both speaking English, we can completely get off on the wrong foot. Ever tried to convince someone you're not being sarcastic? The more you argue, no, I really think you look great in that jacket, John. I really love your leather jacket. I'm not being sarcastic. The more you try to convince someone that
bald patch really suits you. It sets off your eyes. As the world changes, so too does the perception of genre. This is an editorial, by the way. A 2021 article in The New Yorker covering the Grammy Awards declared in the headline, "Genre is disappearing." They reported how pop artist Justin Bieber was annoyed at being nominated for Best Pop Vocal Album for his record Changes. Why? Well, Bieber wrote on Instagram, "I set out to make an R&B album. Changes was and is an R&B album. It is not being acknowledged as an R&B album, which is very strange to me." The article continues.
Genre was once a practical tool for organising record shops and programming radio stations, but it seems unlikely to remain one in an era in which all music feels like a hybrid, and listeners are no longer encouraged or incentivised to choose a single area of interest.
It's happening in fashion as well. According to Glamour, director Mark's favourite monthly mag. Some of the new fashion trends or genres you need in your closet now include boho 3.0, prep school, country house chic, then there's coastal grandmother, Mark, and what they call dark academia. Think Jordan Peterson. He's apparently the quintessential dark academia look. The conversation around genre isn't going away. End of editorial, back to interview.
So you've been writing about modern genre theory, but can you tell us about old genre theory? Just give us a little, in a nutshell, of what they used to think about genre.
Classical genre theory was such a beautiful, simple place to live. There were 3 genres, and the rules were simple, and everyone knew the rules, and you could judge a work by how well it participated in the rules of that genre. Genres didn't interbreed. Every text had exactly one genre, and you could look up the book, so if you want to learn how to write a play, dramatic work, you could look up the book, the rule on how to write a good play. These were, almost eternal kind of geometric classes of texts. And every text had one genre precisely, and they didn't intermix, they didn't interbreed, and you could kind of divide the world up into genres the way, kind of biologists divide species up into their classes. Now the problem with that is that's never been how genres work. Most texts participate in at least one genre, if not more. And genres are constantly changing. Like what a horror film meant in 1968 is completely different to what a horror film means now. And if you're not kind of alive to those changes, genre gets very, very confusing.
So what marks modern genre theory? Obviously, it sounds already like it's just a loose form. It's just, and I'm saying this deliberately to you, it's just the jazz to the classical.
That's right. We're the cool genre theorists. There's 2 major things.
Oh yeah, Andy also used to work as a pianist, and he's an absolute gun on the jazz piano. In fact, way back in our double episode on music, episodes 27 and 28, we called on listeners at the end to make us a discordant jazz version of our theme song. And who should send us a recording but the Reverend Dr. Andrew Judd. Here it is.
There's 2 major things. Firstly is recognizing that genres are historical creatures, which means that they don't just exist like the rules of algebra as some kind of eternal mathematical truth that every good civilization chances upon. They are made up in history by people. Horror films themselves didn't exist before, obviously, film was invented, but also they used to call sci-fi films kind of creature films. And then all of a sudden, sci-fi was in because of the space program. And these movie studios would just kind of rebrand all their kind of creature films as sci-fi films because they were deeply committed to making money and they wanted to keep selling films. So those kind of, classical genre theory says that can't happen. You can't re-genre a film. You can't turn around and say this genre is changed. Likewise, you look at like a classic horror film like Psycho. Now these days, it wouldn't even probably get classed as a horror film. You'd call it kind of a psychological thriller or something like that. But the genre has changed and evolved. And that doesn't mean that, you're kind of provocatively saying kind of modern genre theory seems a little bit kind of loose and made up. It doesn't mean that genres aren't real. It doesn't mean that they're not stable enough that you can talk about them. Like when you've walked into a horror film and you know the rules of that horror film. But it does mean that we need to be aware that what ancient people thought they were doing in telling a story and what modern people think they're doing by writing a novel, they're different things. And so we need to be good travelers, good guests in foreign cultures. When we read literature from ancient cultures, we can't assume that the rules are the same.
It's interesting that in the best history writing in antiquity, Tacitus, Suetonius, or whatever, you frequently get strange intrusions of supernatural stories right in the middle of pedestrian ones. And yet classical historians today don't look at this and dismiss the whole thing as non-historical. Instead, they try to be good guests. Whatever explains the story, whether an innocent mistake, a false second-hand report, or an ancient miracle, the reader today just has to accept that this stuff is part of the ancient history writing genre. An almost humorous miracle story is recorded by Tacitus at the beginning of the 2nd century. It involves the great Roman general Vespasian, who'd soon be confirmed as emperor. And while he was in Alexandria in the north of Egypt in the year 69-70, on his way to Rome to get the throne, Vespasian was approached by two men. One was blind, the other lame, and they threw themselves in front of him and begged him to heal them. Feeling lucky and having already received prophecies about his good fortune, Vespasian complied. Here's Tacitus telling us the story.
One of the common people of Alexandria, well known for his loss of sight, threw himself before Vespasian's knees, praying him with groans to cure his blindness. Being so directed by the god Serapis, whom this most superstitious of nations worships before all others, and he besought the emperor to deign to moisten his cheeks and eyes with his spittle. Another, whose hand was useless, prompted by the same god, begged Caesar to step and trample on it. Vespasian, believing that his good fortune was capable of anything and that nothing was any longer incredible, with a smiling countenance and amid intense excitement on the part of the bystanders, did as he was asked to do. The hand was instantly restored to use, and the day again shone for the blind man. Tacitus, Histories, Book 4.
Contrary to modern tastes, miracle stories are not unusual in our best historical writings from antiquity, and they certainly don't undermine the historical worth of the ancient historical genre. This is just an insight into the perspective, the worldview of the ancients, and that worldview informs the building blocks of their literary genres. We've got to be good guests when reading the genres of other times and places.
I think the modern biography would be a clear example, because we're so interested in the inner life, the psychology of the subject, that hardly features in ancient biographies.
Yeah, I mean, people used to write, classical genre theorists used to write these amazing condescending things about the past. You know, like the ancient Hebrew mind was not sophisticated enough to kind of deal with long stories or deep character development. And it's...
Or a notion of the self, even.
They had no notion of the self, just because they don't write novels. What a ridiculous thing.
They're not as self-absorbed as we are.
That's right. Just because they like to show and not tell, basically, in their narrative style. So we've got to be really careful not to be bad travelers, not to be bad... you're a historian, so you have to be good guests when you're in other people's houses and not assume that, the way I would tell a story is the way to tell a story. It's like music, you sort of have to master the genre before you can innovate in the genre. My first degrees were in English literature. Now, is Shakespeare transcending genre? No, he's mastered them and he transforms them, but often he plays around with genre. So, a genius doesn't kind of transcend genre any more than a poet transcends the alphabet. It's actually just part of the intellectual furniture they're using.
In the Romantic period, they kind of liked this idea that pure genius could hover above.
Yeah, I don't know what they were smoking, but it certainly wasn't healthy for them. Yeah, that's a myth, and that's why people have, after classical genre theory, it kind of got neglected for a while, which is why we have to have modern genre theory. People like to think, oh, no, I'm not constrained by genre. But you're kidding yourself. Of course you are. You can break the rules of a genre, you can play with genre, but the genre is still there.
Genre is all around us, and it always has been. So this becomes crucial when we open up a Bible and try to read it. Stay with us. This episode of Undeceptions is brought to you by Zondervan Academic and their new book, Modern Genre Theory, an introduction for biblical studies by my friend Dr. Andrew Judd. If you don't think genre matters or that it's boring or esoteric, think about the betrayal you might feel if your favourite music artist upped and changed genres from album to album, from, say, country to hip-hop. Or how you'd feel if the lyrics to your favourite song might take on a new meaning if they were sung in a different musical style from what we're used to. Or if you discovered that the artist all along was being ironic, not straightforward, and you'd completely missed the point. How does understanding style help us understand the broader message? That is the area of expertise for Andrew Judd. His groundbreaking new work invites you to explore the relationship between genre and how you interpret something. Andrew argues that this is just going to help us get closer to what the Bible really means, and therefore closer to what the Christian faith is all about, and if you're already a believer, closer to God. It can be confusing for skeptics and believers to make head or tail of some bits of the Bible, especially the really weird ones like apocalyptic or prophecy or whatever. With practical examples and engaging, sometimes very funny analysis, Modern Genre Theory will equip you with the tools you need to navigate the complex world of biblical genres and help you appreciate the text even more deeply. I can't recommend this strongly enough. You can get a free chapter of Modern Genre Theory by heading to zondervanacademic.com/undeceptions, or buy it now on Amazon or wherever good books are sold. Check out the links in the show notes for more. zondervanacademic.com/undeceptions.
We used to have gentlemen in politics, precious few of them. I wish this chap was a gentleman, but he isn't, and there it is. If you can't have a gentleman, I suppose a hero is the next best thing.
That's an extract from The Rose and the Yew Tree, a tragic romance novel published in 1948 by one Mary Westmacott. Mary is better known by her real name, Agatha Christie. Agatha Christie might be the best-known fiction writer in the Anglophone world anyway, since William Shakespeare, perhaps only comparable to J.K. Rowling today, even though director Mark begged me to compare them to Dan Brown. Across her incredible career, Agatha Christie penned 74 novels, 150 short stories, 16 plays, 2 autobiographies, 7 broadcasts, 3 collections of poems, and dozens more miscellaneous essays. She's best known for crime classics like And Then There Were None. But she wrote under the pseudonym Westmacott so she could explore what her daughter described as bittersweet stories about love. This genre switching is pretty common among great writers. J.K. Rowling became Robert Galbraith for crime fiction, and C.S. Lewis wrote A Grief Observed under the name N.W. Clerk because he wanted to navigate personal grief. Changing genres lets authors explore different sides of the human experience. The Bible does something similar, but in a hugely expanded way.
All right, so maybe in a rapid-fire way, list me all the genres in the Bible that you think are valid genres.
All right, so we've got historical narrative, we've got genealogies, we've got temple construction guides, we've got liturgies, we've got case law, we've got general laws and instructions, we've got stories that operate as warnings to people not to do the same things. You've got poetry, you've got songs, you've got cooking recipes, you've got...
Hang on, where's my cooking recipe?
Well, I mean, Ezekiel has one where he's meant to cook his food over human excrement as a sign act. You've got you've got...
It's not a recommended
No, not
recipe.
in that case. But there's all sorts of other... you've got saga with the kind of the Abraham cycle. You've got epistles in the New Testament. I'm a bit taken aback, John. There's just too many to mention.
We've also got erotic poetry, in the Song of Songs, wisdom literature in the Proverbs, and what Old Testament scholar C. John Collins calls exalted prose narrative. More on that soon. One of the most digestible genres found in the Bible is letters. We call them epistles, and we've got a ton of them in the Bible, from the apostles Peter and Paul, from the brothers of Jesus, that's James and Jude, and a few others.
One dominant style of writing in the New Testament is letter. The letter. And you play on Carly Simon's famous song, You're So Vain. I bet you think this song is about you. What are you saying there? You're saying these letters aren't to us? You know, if I got up this morning and I read Philippians, is this not just Paul, or even better, the Holy Spirit speaking to me directly?
Well, the irony of the song, John, is that if you are so vain as to think it's about you, then it is about you, because it's about it's about vanity. Yeah, I like that song. I couldn't afford the royalties, by the way, to quote more than the title in the book, which is why it was going to cost a lot of money to quote the first line of that song. Okay, example I'll give you. So Paul says, please bring my cloak and my scrolls. And by the way, watch out for metal workers called Alex. What do we do with that? Did you bring your cloak and your scrolls today, John? I mean, I thought you were a Bible-believing Christian.
If there are any metal workers named Alex listening to this, write into the show, you get a free book.
That's right. Watch out for welders.
Seriously? If you're a metal worker called Alex, drop us a line at kaylee@undeceptions.com. kaylee@undeceptions.com. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll put that address in the show notes, of course. We promise to send you a book or two.
Because I think those they're silly examples in a way. Like, no one really preaches on that section of Paul's letters. But they do remind us in an uncomfortable way that a letter by its very nature is an occasional piece of writing. In other words, I write from a person to a person for a particular purpose in a particular time. And normally within a relationship that I'm trying to, why did you email me, John? Why didn't you just talk to me when we were lining up this interview? Well, because we were in different cities. And so a letter or an email is designed to bridge the distance between friends or business acquaintances or whatever. So a letter by its very nature is written to Timothy, is written to Titus, is written to Philemon. Now, that's not to say it can't also be God's word for us, but we just have to work a little bit harder to make sure that we don't jump to conclusions. And that we understand the context it's written into first before we apply it to ourselves.
The Bible's letters are pretty straightforward, stylistically anyway. Next up is a genre that's more difficult and much more confronting. And just a heads up too, we're going to be talking about some intense content in the next few minutes, including assault. So feel free to skip the next bit.
This is the movie that Rex Reed called the most horrifying motion picture I have ever seen. This film is positively ruthless in its attempt to drive you right out of your mind. It accomplishes everything it sets out to do with brilliance and unparalleled terror.
Franklin!
This is the horror movie to end them all.
Oh man, you can blame researcher Al for that, and for any heavy metal reference you hear on Undeceptions. That's the first trailer for the infamous 1974 horror film, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's packed with suspense, eeriness, and just enough intrigue to draw audiences in. It pioneered horror staples like the masked villain, the final girl trope, and unconventional weapons, like chainsaws. To outsiders like me, these elements are just weird and disturbing. To aficionados like Al, they're to be expected. They're part of the building blocks of the genre. Andrew Judd reckons we should apply a similar categorization to parts of the Bible, especially to the Book of Judges, which contains, among other things, a horrifying report of the sexual exploitation of an innocent woman, handed over to a mob as bait.
Judges 19, terrible story of the concubine who's mistreated in a terrible way. Someone like Richard Dawkins says, see, That's the morality that this ancient text endorses.
Yeah. I remember inviting my aunt along to church to hear me preach, and it was the terrible week to invite her. She was in town visiting, and she came along, and I was actually preaching on not that story, but one of these similar stories from Judges. And she turned to my dad after the Bible reading and said, I can't believe in a God who endorses this stuff. And I think the problem we have with these stories is we assume that whatever happens in the Bible is meant for our kind of instruction, and meant to be, these narrative events are meant to kind of show us the way the world's meant to be. Here are the stories of great and holy people, go do likewise. Now, Judges 19 has been interpreted as sort of a cautionary tale, that if you think that the story itself is horrific, that the history of reading that story in some Christian and Jewish traditions is even worse. They basically say this is a story about why young women, who unfaithful to their husbands get what they have coming to them. It's appalling. I read it like a horror film. Right? Now, in a horror film, you don't expect there to be justice at the end of the story. The horror film's function is to show you that beneath the nice suburban exterior, there is kind of a darkness at the core of society. And I think in the context of Judges, that darkness is being pointed towards the Levite and the priestly establishment. So I think it's a horror film designed to show us just how corrupt Israel has become.
But what are the clues in the text that tell us this isn't just because that's how you want to see it?
Yeah, so you want to be kind of paying attention to these clues, getting feedback. I call it the boomerang test. Chuck it and see what comes back. Mm-hmm. So in the book of in Judges 19, reading it like a morality tale just becomes, it just sort of ignores so much of the detail in the story that it just doesn't really work. The kind of the way that it shows disintegration in society, the way that we have kind of Israelites behaving like Canaanites, all these kind of contextual things don't match up, and then things in the story itself don't seem to work. Just the way that the narrator presents this young woman and what happens to her with horror, and then there's kind of this choir appears at the end to go sort of, you must speak up about this, you must do something, nothing like this has ever been seen. So the story itself, I think, lends itself towards being read in that way. Even just, on the horror film thing, so at one point you have all these kind of men of the town banging against the door, demanding that they bring out the Levite to have sex with him. And I think of two things. I think of like Night of the Living Dead, where the zombies are at the door kind of banging against it and Ben's on the inside kind of trying to keep them at bay. It is this kind of impure other evil that is outside. And then I think of Genesis 19, obviously, which is the kind of a almost parallel story where the town of Sodom is judged for this same mistreatment of an outsider. And that kind of intertextuality, but also kind of the details of the narrative, I think it's very hard to read it as a morality tale when you're paying attention to those things.
Read one way, the way a lot of atheists try to read it, Judges could be seen as endorsing bad behaviour, horror even. But read within its own literary style and purpose, it actually tells us the opposite. Look how far Israel has fallen. And then there's the book of Genesis.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Genesis 1.
So I want to drill down on some biblical examples, and you do your fancy jazz modern genre theory with me.
Sure, yeah.
So Genesis 1, concrete history, right?
Well, not in the way that we would write a history. Right? So there's some weird things it's not how you and I would write a history. Genesis 1, it's not a historical narrative, right? Because it doesn't have, Genesis 2 is more like a narrative, but Genesis 1, it doesn't have a complication which is trying to be resolved, right? So it doesn't have a sequence of events which tries to resolve a conflict or kind of pursue a quest. On the other hand, it's not standard Hebrew poetry either. It doesn't have what's known as apposition, which you get kind of two ideas in kind of a binocular vision of something. So it's down on the poetry end of the spectrum, but it's not a standard reign of Jehoiakim kind of history either.
What are the devices in Genesis 1 that tip it just slightly more toward poetry than historical prose or whatever?
So, the obvious one would be the repetition. Right? So evening, morning, the first day, evening, morning, the second day. Now, in a standard narrative, you don't need to tell people that kind of morning follows evening. That's what the word day sort of tends to mean. So why does it repeat this kind of structure unnecessarily? And then there's just the fact that the events themselves don't appear to be chronologically linked in with chapter 2. So in chapter 2, humanity is made sort of at the start because the world can't be gardened without a gardener. In chapter 1, humanity is at the end. In chapter 1, you have sort of like plants before the sun. So where's the photosynthesis coming from? There's all these kind of puzzles about the chronology, which...
But our creationist friends might hear you say that and think, oh, that's just the classic kind of, trying to find contradictions to push Genesis 1 out of the literal basket. But you've got more sort of literary observations. Like even if we didn't have Genesis 2, you've got things that you see in Genesis 1 that tell us it's a different kind of literature from...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's highly structured and ordered into those kind of 6 days where you've got sort of the spaces created, the forms created on days 1, 2, and 3, and then those spaces filled in 4, 5, and 6. So the kind of...
It's like a canvas.
Yeah, and then the filling.
1, 2, 3, and then the painting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the kind of the form of the heavens is created in day 1, but then in day 4, the light bearers are included. Now, I don't have much skin in the game in terms of the scientific kind of side of that. I'm a literary person, but I'm committed to the truth of Genesis 1. I just want to make sure I'm reading it on its own terms. Like, what kind of truth are we talking about?
And what function do you think Genesis 1 has? Because an important part of modern genre theory is that it has a social function. It's doing something in the reader. What would you say Genesis 1 is peculiarly doing for the reader?
I go with Calvin on this. So in Calvin's day,
Dr. Judd means John Calvin, the 16th century French theologian and reformer. He wrote a lot, thousands of letters, hundreds of sermons, dozens of books, and 50 biblical commentaries. He's like the Agatha Christie of theology. In terms of volume of output, I mean. He's obviously nothing like Christie to read. He's way more interesting.
So in Calvin's day, the scientific debate of the time was not evolution, but it was about the size of the heavenly bodies, right? Because they knew at that time, astronomically, that the moon is smaller than the stars, right? They weren't stupid, they knew that. And so the people in Calvin's day said, well, obviously Genesis 1 is broken. It's an unreliable guide to astronomy because it says there's a greater light. One of the greater lights is the moon, but the stars are the lesser lights. And Calvin says, you're morons. I mean, he doesn't use the word moron, he says you're janglers, which I think is about the same thing. He says the point is not, the social function, if you like, is not that you would learn the relative mass of the sun and the moon and the stars. It's meant to bring you to worship. And so I actually think Genesis 1 is a liturgical piece. I think it's actually a call to worship.
And that would explain its repetition and its fourfold structure and so
Absolutely,
on.
John. As Anglicans, where do we regularly hear repetition as a way of training the soul?
Nice to see a prayer book right here on your desk.
Prayer book on the desk, that's right. It's liturgical, and I think if you want to kind of, I think of Genesis 1 like a 7-panel stained glass window in a church, but maybe the audiobook version, because they didn't have diagrams in those days. It leads you through kind of considering the world and our place in it, and the goal is the seventh day. It's the kind of the Sabbath. It's worship. It's this kind of temple. It's a literary temple designed to call you to worship. I guess my particular take on Genesis 1 is whether it's historical or kind of more down the liturgy end. But what I'm dead against is these sort of really blunt binaries that we impose from our literature. Because, I mean, we're quite impoverished literarily, I think, in a lot of Western education systems. We think there's things that are poetic and there's things that are true. I was talking to my brother-in-law about this, and he's like, well, is it kind of true, or is it that poetry nonsense? Mm-hmm. You know, and just in that binary, it reveals something about how we see the world. Whereas I happen to think poetry and liturgy can tell the truth. The example I use with my students is Wilfred Owen's World War I poetry. So Wilfred Owen wrote moving accounts of, seeing his friends die from mustard gas in the trenches of World War I. Now, is that poetic?
Wilfred Owen's story is tragic. He enlisted in 1915 and survived to the last week of the war, when he was shot on the 4th of November 1918, crossing a canal in northern France. His mother received the news of his death on Armistice Day, the 11th, just as church bells rang throughout Europe to celebrate the peace. Anyway, Owen wrote around 80 poems, mostly published after his death.
Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, many had lost their boots but limped on bloodshod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of tired, outstripped 5-9s that dropped behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Wilfred Owen, Dulce et decorum est.
Now, is that poetic or is it true? I think the question is ridiculous. No one is denying that he was there in the trenches, but nor do we think that poetry sort of needs to tell us the name and the date of the particular person that he's describing choking to death on mustard gas. We can have something that is both poetic and deeply true. The question is what truth is trying to be communicated.
Let's press pause. I've got a 5-minute Jesus for you. The Bible has multiple genres, but Jesus himself used multiple genres to convey his message. We have straightforward, you could call it legislation.
Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbour as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. Matthew chapter 22.
Then there's aphorism with a good measure of metaphor.
Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road is easy that leads to destruction, and there are many who take it. For the gate is narrow and the road is hard that leads to life, and there are few who find it. Matthew chapter 7.
We have classic Jewish hyperbole.
You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. Matthew chapter 5.
And of course, Jesus was famous for the parable.
With what can we compare the kingdom of God, or what parable will we use for it? It's like a mustard seed, which, when sown upon the ground, is the smallest of all the seeds on earth. Yet when it is sown, it grows up and becomes the greatest of all the shrubs, and puts forth large branches so that the birds of the air can make nests in its shade. Mark chapter 4.
He could also speak apocalyptic.
There will be signs in the sun, the moon, the stars, and on the earth of distress among nations, confused by the roaring of the sea and the waves. People will faint from fear and foreboding of what is coming upon the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now when these things begin to take place, stand up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Luke chapter 21.
And of course, for those who don't like the sparks and flowers and bells and whistles, Jesus could also speak plainly, say in Mark chapter 8, about ultimate things.
Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? Mark chapter 8.
You can press play now. In India, hundreds of thousands of vulnerable women and children face a dangerous holiday season, with rising rates of sexual abuse, forced marriages, and physical abuse across the country. This Christmas, Anglican Aid is helping give these precious people a better chance. And you can help too. Anglican Aid is partnering with the Bangalore Women's Safe House to provide crisis accommodation for up to 40 women at a time. But many more of these houses are needed, and you can make that happen by heading to anglicanaid.org.au/undeceptions. anglicanaid.org.au/undeceptions, and give a tax-deductible donation to their Light and Life Christmas appeal. anglicanaid.org.au/undeceptions. Thank you. This episode is brought to you by our friends at Ridley College and the Explore Ridley Online initiative. If you've ever thought about tertiary biblical study, Ridley has you covered. I used to work there. It's a wonderful place. The college offers online qualifications in ministry, ranging from diploma to master's level. You'll also get a chance to sit under the teaching of some Undeceptions favourites, including Mike Bird and some bloke called John Dixon. I think I teach Jesus in one of their online courses. Anyway, head to ridley.edu.au/undeceptions, ridley.edu.au/undeceptions, and try a free sample lesson today. But make sure you include Undeceptions. There's one biblical genre that's been misunderstood more than any other. We've touched on it before on Undeceptions.
Revelation is so filled with imagery and requires interpretation and imagination, always peppered with a little bit of speculation. It can lead to people seeing in the text what they want to see. They can see the characters that they want to see.
That's Scott McKnight from our episode The Apocalypse, link in the show notes. He points out that it's a badly misused book. People try to use it to predict Christ's return, who the Antichrist is going to be, when Armageddon is going to take place, and some have even lobbied for foreign policy initiatives because of it. It's not the text's fault. Revelation is a sophisticated example of its literary style. It's the fault of modern ignorance. And it's because of that ignorance that our Eastern Orthodox friends don't read from the book of Revelation in their public church services. They read tons of the Bible, pretty much all of it, in their set calendar of readings, but they avoid this one. Now, that's not because they reject its divine authority. It's because they don't trust humans who haven't been trained to read this particular genre. I mean, they've got a point, right?
And I saw another mighty angel coming down from heaven, wrapped in a cloud, with a rainbow over his head. His face was like the sun, and his legs like pillars of fire. He held a little scroll open in his hand. Setting his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land, he gave a great shout, like a lion roaring. And when he shouted, the 7 thunders sounded.
And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him.
So the 4 angels were released, who had been held ready for the hour, the day, the month, and the year, to kill 1/3 of humankind. The number of the troops of cavalry was 200 million. I heard their number, and this was how I saw the horses in my vision. The riders wore breastplates the color of fire and of sapphire and of sulfur. The heads of the horses were like lions' heads, and fire and smoke and sulfur came out of their mouths. By these 3 plagues, 1/3 of humankind was killed, by the fire and smoke and sulfur coming out of the horses' mouths.
So, apocalyptic? What on earth?
What is it? What's an apocalypse?
And it's the climax of the Bible.
Yeah, Revelation, letters and apocalypse. So apocalypse is a genre that the kind of emerges, let's say, within kind of the Persian period in Jewish literature, which is sort of, it's for people in distress, primarily, like that's the social...
The Persian period is about 550 to 330 BC. The Israelites had been conquered by the Babylonians, then they were at the mercy of the Persians. And even though they were allowed back to their homeland to rebuild the temple and the rest of Jerusalem, things just never seemed like the prophets had promised. Go back and listen to Between Testaments for more on that. That's episode 54. But my point is, apocalyptic as a genre emerges in this depressed Second Temple period as the Jewish people were trying to cling to cosmic hope amid catastrophic disappointments.
In distress, primarily, like that's the social... It's kind of the empires are just sort of... We're beyond some kind of political solution to the problems that we see around, and we're people in distress, either moral distress, the corruption of the nation, or we're in a kind of just historical oppression, tyranny, that kind of thing. And it's really peering behind the curtain to see, what on earth is God doing here? Is this a managed universe or not? Right? Is there someone in control? And it sort of peers back the curtain to show us the spiritual forces, I guess, behind the scenes, which help us understand the present. Now, it's wild. Like it's strange literature, particularly if you're not kind of used to it. If you haven't read some of the Old Testament apocalypses, like the end of Daniel or 1 Enoch, which is the other.
And that's the thing, is that we know there are other examples. I mean,
absolutely,
we would be at
absolutely,
sea
absolutely.
if Revelation was our only example of this writing.
Absolutely. So thank God we have these other examples where we can go, oh, okay, this is the genre, right? Because where people get themselves in trouble is they read apocalypses on the explicit assumption that it is the same as historical narrative or prophecy. So that is, it's just describing what's happened. And so if something...
Jesus will come back on a white horse.
There will be a white horse, or there are 144,000 people who are saved, or any of those things. And we can kind of easily miss the point of what the literature's trying to do. So these, the description of the beasts in Daniel, and then we cut to God on his throne judging the world. We can get all wrapped up in kind of what order, which beast or which kind of part of the statue, whatever represents which empire, as if the purpose of this text was to give us sort of like a bit of a form guide for the rise and fall of the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans. Whereas, of course, the point is not just to kind of tell us history in advance. The point is to help us see that whatever the empires that seem to be completely unstoppable of the day, eventually God's kingdom will prevail. And it does this in amazing apocalyptic language and images and numbers, and it's a bit wild. It's not to everyone's taste.
No.
But if you read Revelation without knowing that, that's the way to start a cult, John.
Yeah.
Researching this chapter, my YouTube suggested videos will never recover. Because you can just go on a wild flight of fancy. To understand apocalyptic literature, you sort of need to understand what's going on for people who are experiencing empire and why they would reach for an apocalyptic kind of toolbox in order to express themselves.
Yeah. Okay, I mean, this is sort of a macro question about this whole genre question. Why can't the Bible just say what it means and mean what it says?
Why can't the Bible be written the way I would write the Bible? I mean, this comes back to our cultural assumptions about the right way to communicate something. And again, I just think we have to be good guests. The Bible came into a particular culture with particular genres. Now, you and I might say, well, why couldn't it just be written the way that a 21st century Australian would write the Bible? And the answer is because God chose to reveal himself, to speak to people across a variety of cultures. And so they use different genres to communicate that. So I think it's actually, it's an unself-reflective question, actually, if I can throw that back to you in that way, because there is no one right way to communicate truth.
It's a pretty interesting point to consider. Imagine if the whole Bible had been written by some boring historian, or an apocalypticist or poet, or a lawyer. No offense. But God isn't just one thing. He's a historian, a poet, a singer, an artist, a literati, and a legislator. And he wants to speak to every human intellect and temperament, including to those who don't believe.
Final question for the doubter, I guess, specifically, that's listening into this. What's the value of it? Because I could imagine some people thinking, you can never know anything about what the Bible means.
I think there are some readings of the Bible that are better than others. So one genre question that I've spent a lot of time thinking about is the way that pre-Civil War American preachers, both abolitionist and pro-slavery, interpreted historical narratives in the Bible.
Like Genesis 16.
Like Genesis
I was
16.
going to ask you about that. Maybe this is a good place to land.
Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai," she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." She gave this name to the Lord, who spoke to her. "You are the God who sees me," for she said, "I have now seen the one who sees me." That is why the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It is still there, between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. Genesis 16.
So here you have a story about the great patriarch Abram and Sarai and their slave, their Egyptian slave, Hagar. Those who were pro-slavery looked at that and went, oh, well, clearly God is totally in favour of slavery. The great patriarch here has a slave. In fact, the enslaved person Hagar, runs away and is sent straight back by the angel in the desert. Case closed. God is pro-slavery. But I spent a lot of time reading that and reading those pro-slavery sermons and pamphlets, even speeches in Congress that were made. And then I spent a lot of time reading the anti-slavery, the abolitionist writers. There's lots of people who say, no, actually, the fact that Abraham does something in the story doesn't make it right, because the Bible presents patriarchs and matriarchs doing all sorts of terrible things. And I tried to get back, can we say that one of those readings is better than the other? Because it comes down to questions of genre, really, in that story. Is this an example for us, or is it a narrative about God's promise to this enslaved person, Hagar? And the conclusion that I came to was actually, you can read the genre however you want, right? The ball is in the reader's court by this point, right? The writer has played their shot. It is entirely possible to read it as an example to follow. Abraham had slaves, you should too. But it's a worse reading because it requires you to ignore so much of what the text is doing. It requires you to mangle the different elements of the text to fit it into that reading. And the payoffs for the kind of pro-slavery reading are actually worse. I think in fairly kind of demonstrable ways, it's a worse reading of the text. So yeah, I do think you can, in one level, you can read the Bible however you want, but the Bible might not play along.
If you like what we're doing, you can let us know it by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or leaving a comment on Spotify. We love hearing your feedback. You can head to undeceptions.com and leave us a question there, either by text or our preference is voice record. Voice questions are so fun, and producer Kaylee might include it in a future Q&A episode. While you're at undeceptions.com, why not consider helping the show even more? There's a great, big, beautiful yellow donate button. You know what to do. As always, make sure you devour the show notes on our site, where you'll find a transcript of this episode and all the other ones, as well as a ton of links to cool stuff we mention in the show. They're way too long to include in the teeny notes section in your podcast app, so you really got to go to undeceptions.com to get that. See ya. Undeceptions is hosted by me, John Dixon, produced by Kaylee Payne and directed by Mark Ski-Fi Hadley. Alistair Belling is a researcher and writer and horror movie aficionado. Siobhan McGuinness is our online librarian. Lindy Leviston remains my wonderful assistant. Santino DeMarco is Chief Finance and Operations Consultant, editing by Richard Humwe. Our voice actors today were Yannick Laurie and Dakota Love. Special thanks to our series sponsor Zondervan for making this Undeception possible. Undeceptions is the flagship podcast of undeceptions.com, letting the truth out. An Undeceptions podcast.